The manor on the cliff had not seen visitors in 73 years, and that was precisely how Valdres Morvain preferred it. He stood at the window of the eastern tower, watching the sea crash against the rocks below, with the patience of one who had watched oceans rise and fall, empires crumble to dust, and love wither into memory more times than he cared to count. The glass was old, hand-blown in a century when craftsmen still believed their work could outlast them. They had been wrong, of course. Everything dies, everything except those cursed never to. Behind him, in the velvet darkness of the tower room, his son sat motionless before a canvas that had remained blank for 6 months. The brushes lay untouched, the paints had begun to separate in their tubes, and Alexei, beautiful, broken Alexei, simply stared at the white expanse as though waiting for it to speak first. He had not uttered a word in 217 years. Valdres turned from the window, his ancient eyes finding his son's silhouette in the gloom. Alexei was frozen at 23, the age he had been when Valdres had made the choice no father should ever make. The choice between watching his son die of the plague that swept through their village in the Carpathian Mountains, or condemning him to an eternity of silence. The curse had been the price. Valdres had known it even as he'd torn open his own wrist and pressed it to his dying son's lips. The witch who had first made Valdres what he was, Marana, keeper of the old bargains, had warned him centuries before. "You may make another," she had whispered, her voice like dead leaves scraping across stone. "But the one you love most will lose the thing you treasure most about them." Alexei had been a singer. His voice had been the sound of morning light breaking through storm clouds, of hope persisting in hopeless times. Villagers had traveled for miles to hear the boy sing at festival masses, and Valdres, who had abandoned his humanity, his throne, everything, had remained in that forgotten corner of the world for decades simply to hear his son's voice echo through the mountain valleys. Now that voice was gone, stolen, locked somewhere deep inside, a boy who was no longer a boy, who would never be a man, who existed in the eternal twilight between life and death, with no way to speak his sorrow. "Come," Valdres said softly, extending a hand that had once wielded swords, signed treaties, ended wars. "The night is clear. We should walk." Alexei did not move. He rarely did any more. The first century of silence had been filled with attempts, sign language learned and forgotten, written words that grew shorter and shorter until they stopped entirely, painted images that once spoke volumes but had gradually faded to this, a blank canvas and a hollow stare. Valdres lowered his hand. He had stopped expecting responses decades ago, but still he tried. Still he spoke to his son as though words might eventually find their way back to him, as though love alone could break the curse that held his voice hostage. "Very well," he murmured, "I will walk alone." The cliffside path wound down through gnarled pines that had grown twisted from centuries of salt wind. Valdres descended without hurry. Immortals had no need of hurry, until he reached the small fishing village that clung to the shore below the manor. Dunhaven, they called it now. It had been called other things before. He had watched its name change 4 times, watched its people live and die in endless cycles, watched their fear of the manor on the cliff transform from active terror to passive superstition to something approaching indifference. The younger generations did not believe in vampires. They believed in mortgages and social media and the comfortable certainty that the darkness held nothing more threatening than their own reflections. Valdres moved among them unseen, not invisible, merely unremarkable. He had learned long ago how to fold himself into the shadows of a crowd, how to seem like just another stranger passing through. The village had one pub, one church, one general store, and one diner that stayed open until midnight for the fishermen who worked odd hours. It was the diner he found himself approaching, though he could not have said why. The neon sign flickered. "Elena's," it read, in letters that buzzed with tired electricity. And through the fogged windows he could see the shapes of a few late-night patrons, hunched over coffee cups and half-eaten plates. Valdres had no need of food, no hunger for anything this place could offer. And yet his hand found the door, and his feet carried him inside, and the bell above the frame chimed with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. She was behind the counter. He noticed her the way one notices a single candle burning in a cathedral of darkness, not because she was extraordinary by mortal standards, but because there was something in her stillness that reminded him of Alexei. She moved with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to being overlooked, wiping down the counter in slow circles. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that suggested her thoughts were very far from this place. "Sit anywhere," she said without looking up. "Kitchen's closing in 20, but I can still get you something simple." Her voice was unremarkable. Her face was unremarkable. And yet, Valdres found himself drawn to the booth in the corner, the one that allowed him to watch her work while remaining cloaked in shadow, and he sat there for nearly an hour without ordering anything at all. She did not seem to mind. She did not seem to notice. When midnight came, the other patrons shuffled out into the night, and still Valdres remained. The woman, Elena, presumably, or perhaps she had simply inherited the name along with the diner, began stacking chairs on tables, her movements unhurried, despite the late hour. "We're closing," she said finally, and this time her eyes found his across the room. Valdres felt something stir in his chest. Not hunger. He had fed 3 nights ago and had centuries of practice controlling such urges. Something else, something he had almost forgotten how to name. "Forgive me," he said, rising. "I lost track of time." She studied him for a moment, her head tilting slightly. "You're from the manor." It was not a question. Valdres felt his stillness sharpen, the predator in him surfacing for just a moment before he forced it down. "What makes you say that?" "No one local dresses like that." She gestured vaguely at his coat, black wool, cut in a style that had been fashionable sometime around 1890. "And no one passes through Dunhaven. There's nothing to pass through to." Valdres inclined his head. "I am a resident of the area, yes, though I rarely venture into town." "I know." She turned back to her work, lifting another chair onto a table. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the manor, said a count lived there once, a foreigner with a son who never spoke, said they'd been there since before her grandmother's time." She paused, looking at him over her shoulder. "She also said they never aged." The silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. "Your grandmother," Valdres said carefully, "sounds like she had a vivid imagination. She was the most practical woman I ever knew." Elena set down the last chair and crossed her arms, regarding him with an expression that held neither fear nor accusation, only a calm, measured curiosity. "She said if I ever met the man from the manor, I should offer him kindness. She said he carried enough sorrow to drown the sea." Valdres felt the centuries pressing down upon him, all the weight of memory and loss and endless, endless time. This woman should not be speaking to him this way. She should be afraid or dismissive or blind to what he was. And yet she stood there in her stained apron, with dark circles under her eyes and coffee grounds on her fingers, and she looked at him as though she could see straight through to the hollow place where his heart used to beat. "Your grandmother was wise," he managed. "She was." Elena's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Come back tomorrow night if you like. I'll save you the corner booth." She turned away then, disappearing through the kitchen doors, and Valdres stood alone in the empty diner with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the strange, impossible sensation that something had just shifted in the fabric of his eternal existence. He should not return. He knew this with the certainty of 800 years of survival. He returned anyway. The second night, he ordered coffee he did not drink. The third night, he asked her name. Elena, she confirmed, though she'd inherited both the diner and the name from a great-aunt she'd never met. The fourth night, she sat across from him after closing, and they talked until the horizon began to lighten, and Valdres was forced to retreat to the shadows of the cliff path. She did not ask what he was. She did not ask why he only appeared after dark, or why his skin was cold when their fingers accidentally brushed, or why his eyes seemed to catch the light like a cat's when he turned a certain way. She asked, instead, about the books he read and the places he had seen and the weight he carried in his silence. "You have a sadness," she said on the 7th night. "That feels older than you look." Valdres set down his untouched coffee. "I have lived a long time." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She waited. She had a gift for waiting, he had noticed. A patience that seemed almost supernatural in its depth. Perhaps that was why he found himself speaking when he had intended to remain silent, found himself telling her about Alexei without quite meaning to. "My son," he said, the words scraping against his throat like rust. He does not speak, has not spoken in a very long time. Elena's expression shifted, sympathy pooling in her dark eyes. An illness? A curse. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. One that I brought upon him through my own choices. She did not laugh. She did not dismiss him as mad or melodramatic. She simply nodded, as though curses were a perfectly reasonable explanation, and said, "Have you tried to break it? For 2 centuries. And nothing has worked?" Valdres shook his head. "The witch who cast it told me only that he would speak again when he found something worth speaking for. I have offered him everything, art, music, travel, the whole of the world laid at his feet. Nothing reaches him. Nothing wakes him from this silence." He paused, his ancient hands curling into fists on the table. "I begin to think the curse cannot be broken, that she lied, as her kind often do, and my son is damned to silence for eternity." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his fist. Warm against cold, living against dead, mortal against immortal. "Bring him here," she said. Valdres looked up, startled. "Here?" "To the diner." She shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not offering a miracle, but sometimes the things we need aren't grand gestures or magical solutions. Sometimes they're just a different place, a different person, a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee at midnight. He won't eat, he won't speak, he barely moves. Then he can sit." Her grip tightened on his hand. "And I can talk. I'm told I'm quite good at filling silences." Against every instinct, against centuries of caution and isolation, Valdres found himself considering it. Elena had a quality he could not name, a groundedness, a quiet strength, an ability to make the impossible seem almost reasonable. "Tomorrow," he heard himself say, "I will bring him. Tomorrow." The walk back to the manor took longer than usual. Valdres moved slowly, lost in thought, trying to understand what madness had possessed him to agree to such a thing. Alexei had not left the manor in decades, had not interacted with a mortal in even longer. The boy, for he would always be a boy to Valdres, frozen at the threshold of manhood, had retreated so far into himself that Valdres sometimes wondered if anything remained of the son he had known. And yet, Elena had asked, and Valdres had agreed, and somewhere beneath the weight of 800 years, something that felt almost like hope had begun to stir. He found Alexei where he had left him, before the blank canvas, unmoving, his brush dry in his hand. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the tower windows, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. "Alexei." Valdres knelt beside his son's chair, reaching out to touch his cold hand. "Tomorrow night, I am taking you into the village. There is someone I want you to meet." No response, not a flicker of acknowledgement in those empty eyes. Valdres sighed, the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. "She is different, this woman. She sees more than she should. She asks nothing that I cannot give. She makes me remember what it was like to be seen." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Perhaps she can do the same for you." Still nothing. Valdres had not expected otherwise. But when the next night came and he descended to the tower to collect his son, Alexei was already standing by the door, dressed for the first time in months, in clothes that were not paint-stained or threadbare. His face was still blank, his eyes still hollow, but he was waiting. Valdres felt his unbeating heart lurch. "Come," he said, barely trusting his voice. "Let us go." The walk down the cliff path was silent. Alexei moved like a ghost, present but not present, following his father's lead without seeming to see the path before him. The village was quiet, most windows dark, only the glow of Elena's diner spilling out onto the empty street. The bell chimed as they entered. Elena looked up from the counter, and her face transformed when she saw them, not with fear, as Valdres had half expected, but with something that looked almost like recognition, as though she had been waiting for them, as though she had always been waiting. "You came," she said, and her smile was sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Valdres guided Alexei to the corner booth, and his son sat without protest, his empty gaze fixed on the tabletop. Elena approached with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down with the practiced ease of a woman who had served thousands of customers in her lifetime. "Hello," she said to Alexei, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm Elena. Your father's told me about you." "Nothing? Not a flicker?" Elena glanced at Valdres, who had taken a seat at the counter nearby, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to give them space. She returned her attention to Alexei, her expression thoughtful. "He says you don't speak. That's all right. I've known silence all my life. Grew up in this village where nothing ever happens, where the days blur together until you forget what year it is. Married young to a man who spoke so rarely, I sometimes forgot the sound of his voice. Lost him to the sea 5 years ago. The fishing boat went down in a storm, and they never found—" She paused, swallowing. "They never found him?" Alexei's fingers twitched on the tabletop. Elena noticed. Valdres saw her notice, saw the slight widening of her eyes, quickly controlled. "Anyway," she continued, her voice softer now, "I know what it's like to live in silence, to feel like the world is happening on the other side of a glass wall, and you can see it, but you can't touch it, and no one can hear you even if you scream." She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of Alexei's. "You don't have to speak, but I want you to know that I see you. I see you, Alexei." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, so slowly that Valdres thought he might be imagining it, Alexei raised his eyes from the table. They found Elena's face, and something in their depths shifted, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen lake. He still did not speak, but he looked at her. He saw her. And Valdres, watching from the counter, felt the first tear he had shed in 2 centuries slip down his cold cheek. After that night, everything changed. Alexei began to leave the manor, not every night but often, descending the cliff path in the darkness, making his way to the diner where Elena would be waiting with coffee. She knew he wouldn't drink, and conversation she knew he couldn't answer. She talked to him about everything and nothing, the weather, the fishing reports, the gossip from the village, the books she was reading, the dreams she had abandoned, the life she had built from the wreckage of grief. And Alexei listened, truly listened, in a way he had not listened to anything in 200 years. His eyes followed her movements. His body turned toward her when she spoke. Sometimes, when she laughed at her own jokes, the ghost of something that might have been a smile would flicker across his frozen features. "He's changing," Elena said to Valdres one night after Alexei had retreated to his usual booth and she had joined Valdres at the counter. "I don't know how to explain it, but there's more of him there, more presence, more life." Valdres watched his son through the steam rising from his untouched coffee. "You have given him something I could not, something no one else could." "I haven't done anything," Elena protested. "I just talk." "No." Valdres turned to look at her, and his ancient eyes were filled with something vast and painful and grateful beyond words. "You exist. You see him. You treat him as though he matters, as though his silence is simply a fact of him rather than a tragedy to be fixed. You make him feel human again." Elena's cheeks flushed. "He's not human, though, is he?" The question hung in the air. Valdres had known it would come eventually. Elena was too perceptive, too intelligent, too honest to pretend forever. "No," he admitted, "he is not, and neither am I." "I know." She said it simply without drama. "I've known since the first night. My grandmother told me what to look for, the stillness, the cold, the way you move like you're not quite touching the ground, the way you never age, never eat, never breathe unless you remember to. And yet, you invited us into your space, into your life." Elena smiled, sad and small. "My grandmother also told me that the creatures of the night are not monsters, that most of them are just people who lost something precious and gained something terrible in exchange. She said we shouldn't fear them, we should mourn them. Your grandmother was extraordinary." "She was." Elena's eyes grew distant. "She died last year. That's why I came back to Dunhaven, to take over the diner. I'd been living in the city, trying to have a normal life. But after Thomas, my husband, after he died, and then my grandmother," she shook her head, "I realized there was no such thing as normal. There's just life, in whatever strange shape it takes." Valdres felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, it felt almost bearable. "You are remarkable, Elena. I hope you know that." I'm just a waitress in a dying village. But she smiled when she said it, and her eyes found Alexei across the room. He's looking at me again. He was. Alexei's gaze was fixed on Elena with an intensity that Valdris had not seen in his son since before the curse. There was something kindling there, something that looked almost like longing. Valdris felt a chill that had nothing to do with his undead nature. Elena, he said carefully, I must tell you something about the curse. She turned back to him, her expression curious. The witch who cursed my son. She was ancient when I first met her, centuries ago. She was old when Rome fell, old when the pyramids were built. She has power beyond anything you can imagine, and she has a particular talent for cruelty. What did she do? Valdris closed his eyes. When I turned Alexei, I broke one of the oldest laws of our kind. Vampires are not meant to turn those they love, not truly love. The bond it creates is too strong, too dangerous. It makes us vulnerable. He opened his eyes again, and they were haunted. Marana appeared that very night. She told me that Alexei would lose the thing I love most about him, his voice, his gift for song, but that he could regain it only if he found something worth speaking for. And you've never found it? I tried everything: music, art, travel, companionship, other vampires, mortal. Friends, centuries of attempts. Valdris shook his head. Nothing reached him. Until you. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then, you think I might be it? The thing worth speaking for? I think it is possible. The way he looks at you, the way he comes alive in your presence, I have not seen him like this since before the curse. But, Elena, you must understand what this could mean. Tell me. Valdris hesitated. Marana's curses are never simple. They twist, they transform, they demand more than they give. If Alexei speaks for you, if you are the one who breaks his silence, there will be consequences. For him, for you, perhaps for all of us. Elena absorbed this. Her face was pale but composed. What kind of consequences? I do not know. That is what frightens me most. He reached out, his cold hand covering hers on the counter. You do not have to continue this. You do not owe us anything. I can take Alexei away, leave Dunhaven, and you can live your mortal life in peace. And Alexei? Her voice was soft but steady. Would he find peace? Valdris could not answer. They both knew the truth. Then I'm not going anywhere. Elena straightened, her jaw setting with determination that seemed to have been forged in some deep, quiet fire. I've been waiting my whole life for something that matters. I didn't know what it was until now. But I think... She looked across the room at Alexei, and something passed between them, silent, profound, undeniable. I think he's been waiting too. 3 months passed. Elena learned the rhythms of her strange new life, the diner during the day, the vampires at night, the impossible love story unfolding in the spaces between. Alexei began to draw again, filling canvas after canvas with images of Elena. Elena laughing, Elena working, Elena standing at the window watching the sea. He left them on the diner counter like offerings, like prayers, like all the words he could not say. She kept every one. The villagers noticed, of course. They noticed the strange young man who appeared only after dark, who sat in the corner booth and watched the waitress with eyes that seemed to hold entire centuries. They noticed Elena's transformation, the way she smiled more, laughed more, seemed more present in her own skin than she had since returning to Dunhaven. You've got a suitor, old Mrs. Hartley commented one evening, her rheumy eyes twinkling with mischief. Elena just smiled and refilled her coffee. Maybe I do, but beneath the surface, tension was building. Valdris felt it first, a shifting in the ancient currents that flowed beneath the world, a disturbance in the darkness that had been his home for 800 years. Something was coming, something old and angry and hungry. Marana. He smelled her before he saw her. That particular scent of grave earth and dying flowers that had haunted his nightmares since the night she'd cursed his son. She materialized in the tower of the manor, one evening, just as the sun was setting, her form flickering like a candle flame in wind. Little king, she crooned, her voice like bones grinding together. You've found something precious, haven't you? Valdris positioned himself between the witch and the door to Alexei's room. What do you want, Marana? Only to collect what is owed. Her smile was a wound in the fabric of reality. The curse approaches its conclusion. The boy stirs. The voice strains against its chains. Soon he will speak, and then... Her laughter was the sound of coffins closing. Then we shall see what price the universe demands. I will not let you harm him. Harm him? Marana's eyes, black as the void between stars, widened in mock innocence. I would never harm the boy. The curse harms him. The love harms him. His own desperate heart, reaching toward that mortal woman, harms him. I merely observe. I merely collect. What do you mean? Marana drifted closer, her form leaving trails of shadow in the air. The boy's voice was taken as payment for your sin. It can be returned, but only in exchange for something of equal value. Something he treasures more than song, more than speech, more than existence itself. Valdris felt ice flooding his veins. What would that be? You already know, little king. Marana's smile was poison. Why else would you be so afraid? She vanished, leaving only the scent of death and the echo of her laughter. Valdris stood frozen for a long moment. Then he turned and ran to Alexi's room, ran down the cliff path, ran to the diner where Elena was closing up for the night. She looked up in alarm as he burst through the door. Valdris, what's wrong? The witch, he gasped, though vampires did not need to breathe. She came. She told me... He could not finish, could not say the words aloud. Elena set down the rag she'd been using to wipe tables. Tell me. So he did. He told her everything Marana had said, everything he feared, everything he had been trying to protect her from since the beginning. When he finished, Elena was pale but calm. So, if Alexei speaks, she said slowly, he'll lose something else, something precious. Something he treasures more than his voice, more than song. Valdris's voice cracked. Elena, I think it's you. I think if he speaks your name, the curse will take you from him. Take me how? Kill me? I don't know. Transform you, trap you, erase you from existence. Marana's curses are never clean. He seized her hands, his grip desperate. You have to stay away from him. You have to break this connection before it breaks you. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then gently, she pulled her hands free. No. Elena, no. Her voice was quiet, but absolute. I'm not going to run from this. I'm not going to abandon him because some ancient witch wants to play games with our lives. She moved toward the door, toward the night outside, toward the cliff path that led to the manor. I'm going to see him. I'm going to tell him the truth. And then we're going to decide together what happens next. You don't understand what you're facing. Elena stopped at the door. When she turned back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've faced my husband drowning in a storm I couldn't stop. I've faced my grandmother dying alone because I was too proud to come home. I've faced empty days and silent nights and a life that felt like waiting for something that would never come. She lifted her chin. I'm done being afraid, Valdris. If loving your son costs me everything, at least it will have been real. At least it will have mattered. She walked out into the darkness. Valdris wanted to follow her, but he found himself frozen, bound by some invisible force that felt horribly familiar. Marana's magic, he realized. The witch was not content to simply observe. She was ensuring that the final act played out exactly as she intended. All he could do was wait. Elena climbed the cliff path alone. The night was clear, the stars bright overhead, the sea a dark mirror far below. The manor loomed against the sky like a challenge, its windows glowing with faint candlelight. She found Alexei in the tower, sitting before a canvas that held her face. He turned when she entered, and his eyes, those ancient sorrow-filled eyes, widened with something that looked like wonder. I know, she said, crossing to stand before him. I know about the curse. I know what speaking will cost you. Your father told me everything. Alexei's face contorted with emotion. Fear, love, despair, hope, all warring beneath the surface of his frozen features. His hands reached for her, then drew back. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing emerged but silence. It's okay, Elena whispered, falling to her knees before him. She took his cold hands in her warm ones, pressed them against her chest, where her heart beat steady and strong. You don't have to speak. I know what you feel. I feel it too." His eyes filled with something that might have been tears if vampires could weep. "But I need you to understand something." Elena's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not afraid of the curse. I'm not afraid of what it might take from me. Because the life I had before, the waiting, the emptiness, the endless gray days, that wasn't living. This is living. These months with you and your father, this strange, impossible love, this feeling of finally being seen." She squeezed his hands. "That's worth any price. Do you understand?" Alexei stared at her. His mouth worked silently, desperately, as though the words were trapped behind a wall he could not break. And then, Elena. Her name, a whisper, a rasp, a sound so fragile it seemed ready to shatter at the slightest touch. But it was a voice, his voice, the voice that had been silent for 217 years. "Elena," he said again, stronger now, tears he should not be able to cry streaming down his pale cheeks. "Elena, Elena, Elena." She laughed or sobbed or both. Yes, I'm here. I'm here." And then the darkness came. It swept through the tower like a living thing, extinguishing candles, blotting out stars, swallowing all light and sound and warmth. Elena felt hands seizing her, not Alexei's gentle touch, but something cold and cruel and ancient, and she screamed as she was torn away from him. "The price!" Marana's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "The price must be paid." Elena felt herself dissolving, her edges blurring, her memories scattering like leaves in a storm. She saw her grandmother's face, her husband's smile, the endless gray sea that had taken everything from her. She saw Alexei reaching for her across an impossible distance, his mouth forming her name again and again, his newly freed voice crying out in anguish. And she saw something else, a choice, a door that had not been there before, opening in the darkness. "Stay," a voice whispered. It was not Marana's voice. It was older, softer, almost kind. "Stay and pay the price. Become shadow, become silence, become nothing. This is what the curse demands." But there was another option. Elena could feel it, like a second heartbeat beneath her own. "Or give," the voice continued. "Give what was never meant to be taken. Give what was always meant to be shared." Elena understood. The curse had taken Alexei's voice because Valdris had broken the law, because he had turned someone he truly loved. But love was not a crime. Love was a gift, and gifts were meant to be given freely. She thought of all the years she had kept herself closed off, protected, afraid to love too deeply because losing Thomas had nearly destroyed her. She thought of the walls she had built, the silences she had cultivated, the way she had hidden her heart behind coffee cups and casual conversation. And she thought of Alexei, who had spent 2 centuries in a prison of silence, who had been punished for being loved too much. "Take my voice instead," she said into the darkness. "Take my words. I'll give them freely. I'll carry the silence so he doesn't have to." The darkness paused. Marana's presence flickered, uncertain. "The curse demands payment," she hissed. "You cannot simply—" "The curse demands that something precious be lost," Elena interrupted, her voice steady. "But it doesn't say the same person has to lose it. I'm offering myself. I'm choosing this. Isn't that more powerful than theft?" Silence. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. Marana materialized before her, ancient and terrible, but there was something almost like respect in her void black eyes. "You would do this? Sacrifice your voice for a creature you have known only months? He's not a creature." Elena lifted her chin. "He's a person, a wounded, lonely person who has suffered enough. And yes, I would. I do." For a long moment, witch and mortal faced each other in the dying darkness. Then Marana smiled, a real smile, tinged with something almost like sadness. "Love," she murmured, "even after all these centuries it still surprises me." She reached out one shadowy hand and touched Elena's throat. "Very well. The bargain is accepted. The curse is satisfied." Elena felt her voice leaving her, not violently, but gently, like breath fogging on a cold morning. It drifted out of her and dissolved into the air, and in its place she felt something new settling into her chest. not silence exactly. More like peace. "It is done," Marana said, and she began to fade. "But know this, brave mortal, the gift you have given has changed things. The old laws are shifting, and in time," her smile widened, "in time, you may find that love has more power than even I understood." She vanished, and Elena stood alone in the tower, voiceless but whole, as Alexei scrambled to his feet and crossed the room to her in 3 desperate strides. "Elena!" he gasped, his voice raw from centuries of disuse but strong, so strong. "Elena, what did you do? What did you give up?" She could not answer him, could not form the words that crowded in her mind. So instead, she did the only thing she could. She reached up, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him. It was not the kiss of fairy tales, not magic or transformation or breaking of spells. It was something simpler and more profound. 2 wounded souls finding each other in the darkness, choosing each other despite everything, loving each other not in spite of their scars, but because of them. When they finally pulled apart, Valdres was there. He had been freed from Marana's binding the moment the curse was satisfied, and he had run all the way from the diner to the manor, arriving just in time to see his son speaking, weeping, holding a mortal woman who had given everything to save him. "Father," Alexei said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Father? She... I know." Valdres crossed to them, pulling them both into an embrace that should have been cold, but somehow was not. "I know what she did. I know what she gave." Elena leaned into them both, and though she could not speak, her eyes said everything. They said, "I am not afraid." They said, "I chose this." They said, "I love him, I love you both, and I would do it again." The dawn was approaching. Valdres could feel it in his bones, that ancient warning that had kept him alive for 8 centuries. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not want to retreat to the shadows. He wanted to stand here, in this tower, with his son's voice restored and this remarkable woman pressed against them both, and watch the sun rise. "Come," he said finally. "We should go inside. There is much to discuss." But Alexei was looking at Elena with an intensity that made Valdres's heart ache. Can we?" He struggled with the words, unused to having them. "Can you write? Can you tell me?" Elena nodded. She pulled away from them both and crossed to Alexei's easel, where a jar of brushes and a palette of paints still waited. She picked up a fine brush, dipped it in black, and began to write on the blank canvas in elegant flowing script. "I can write. I can paint. I can still tell you everything. And now you can tell me too." Alexei laughed, actually laughed, a sound Valdres had not heard in 2 centuries, and caught her face in his hands and kissed her again. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She smiled at him, and though she could not speak, her silence was not empty. It was full of love and sacrifice and hope. They stayed in the tower until the last possible moment, the 3 of them huddled together against the coming dawn. Valdres told Alexei everything that had happened with Marana, everything the witch had said about old laws shifting and love having more power than expected. Alexei, in turn, struggled through the story of his silence, the centuries of isolation, the gradual fading of hope, the night he had first seen Elena through the diner window and felt something stir in his frozen heart. And Elena listened. She listened with her whole being, her hands clasped in Alexei's, her head resting on Valdres's shoulder. When they needed her response, she wrote on the canvas or traced words on their palms or simply looked at them with eyes that spoke more clearly than any voice could. The sun rose, and they retreated to the inner chambers of the manor. But the darkness felt different now. It was not the darkness of despair, but the darkness of anticipation, of waiting for the next night, the next conversation, the next chapter of a story that was only beginning. Elena moved into the manor a week later. She kept the diner open, running it in the afternoons when the vampires slept, returning to the cliff each evening as darkness fell. The villagers whispered about the strange arrangement, but no one interfered. Dunhaven had always been a place that minded its own business. Alexei painted every day, his canvases filled with images of the life they were building together. Elena at the stove in the manor's ancient kitchen. Elena reading by candlelight. Elena walking the cliff path under a canopy of stars. He gave voice to every thought he'd kept silent for 2 centuries, talking endlessly about art and philosophy and the nature of eternity, and Elena listened and wrote and loved him through it all. Valdres watched them with something that felt almost like peace. He had spent 800 years carrying guilt for what he had done to his son, for the curse, the silence, the centuries of suffering, and now, improbably, impossibly, that weight was lifting. Not because the curse had been broken, but because it had been transformed, taken on by someone who chose it freely, given meaning by love. On the first anniversary of Alexei's restored voice, Elena woke to find a small box in her pillow. Inside was a ring, gold, ancient, set with a stone the color of moonlight. There was a note in Alexei's elegant script, "My mother wore this ring. My father gave it to her on the day they met. She was mortal too, once, but love changed her, as it has changed us all. Wear it, if you wish, and know that whether you stay human or choose to become like us, I will love you until the stars burn out and darkness swallows the world." Elena slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She found Alexei in his studio, and when he looked up at her with hope and terror and love warring in his ancient eyes, she did the only thing she could. She crossed to his easel, picked up a brush, and wrote in bold strokes across the corner of his current canvas, "Yes." The word hung between them, small and infinite. Alexei pulled her into his arms, and his voice, his beautiful rescued voice, whispered against her hair, "I love you! I love you! I love you!" And though Elena could not say it back, her silence was not empty. It was full of everything she could not voice and everything she did not need to. Her heartbeat said it. Her breath said it. The way she held him, the way she looked at him, the way she had given up her own voice so that he could find his, all of it spoke louder than any words ever could. In the doorway, Valdres watched them with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. And for the first time in 8 centuries, the ancient vampire king allowed himself to hope. Outside the manor windows, the night stretched on forever. The sea crashed against the cliffs. The stars burned in their ancient patterns. And somewhere in the darkness, 3 hearts beat, 2 silent, 1 speaking, bound together by a love that defied curses and transcended centuries. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. And in the shadows of the manor on the cliff, in the small diner by the sea, in the painted canvases and written words and silent devotions, their story would continue, forever, and ever, and ever. The last light of the moon touched the tower window as dawn approached once more, and Elena, voiceless, fearless, full of love, watched it fade. Alexei stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Tell me what you're thinking," he murmured, as he did every night now. She reached for the small pad of paper she always carried and wrote, "I'm thinking that silence is not so bad, not when I can hear your voice." He laughed softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I'm thinking that I would give up my voice 1,000 times if it meant keeping you." She shook her head, turning in his arms to face him. Her eyes were firm as she wrote, "No more sacrifices. We've given enough. Now we just live." "Just live," he repeated, tasting the words. "I'm not sure I remember how." Elena smiled and took his hand, leading him toward the inner chambers where Valdres was waiting, with old books and older stories and the endless patience of the immortal. "Then I'll teach you," she wrote. "We'll learn together." And they did. The manor on the cliff, which had stood in darkness for so long, began to fill with light. Candles burned in every window. Music, Alexei learning to sing again, his voice rough but growing stronger, drifted down to the village on clear nights. The diner stayed open later, and sometimes the ancient count himself could be seen sitting at the counter, drinking coffee he did not taste, watching the mortal world with something almost like fondness. The curse was broken, the silence was shared, and in its place love had built something new, not a fairy tale ending, but something better, something real, something that would last until the end of time and beyond. This is where the story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins, in the manor on the cliff, in the diner by the sea, in the space between words and silence, where love lives and breathes and waits for those brave enough to find it. Elena set down her brush and looked at the words she had written on the canvas. Tomorrow she would paint over them and begin again. She always did. But for now, they hung in the air like a blessing. Forever. Outside, the sea whispered its eternal secrets to the shore. The stars wheeled in their ancient dance. And in the heart of the darkness, surrounded by the ones she loved, Elena finally understood what her grandmother had meant all those years ago. The creatures of the night are not monsters. They are just people who lost something precious and gained something terrible. And sometimes, if they are very lucky, they find someone willing to meet them in the shadows, someone willing to stay,